My grandfather built the house on Sycamore Lane with his own hands. That's what everyone always said at Thanksgiving, at Christmas, at every family gathering where someone needed a reason to feel important. Grandpa built this house, as if saying it enough times gave them some claim to it. His name was Walter Greer. He died on a Tuesday in March, quietly, in the hospice bed we'd had set up in the sunroom because he refused, absolutely refused, to spend his last week somewhere that smelled like antiseptic and strangers. I know he died on a Tuesday because I was the one who called the funeral home. I was the one who sat with him through the night before, holding his hand while his breathing changed, while the gaps between each breath grew longer and longer until there was just one final exhale and then nothing. I was 29 years old. I had been living with my grandfather for 14 months. I want to be honest about how that happened because the version my uncle told people wasn't the real one. Grandpa's health started declining 2 years before he died. Small things at first. He'd forget where he put his keys. He'd leave the stove burner on. He called me once at 11 at night because he couldn't remember how to lock the front door. My mom was worried, but she lived 40 minutes away and worked full-time. My uncle lived in Phoenix. My aunt had her hands full with 3 kids under 8, and I was the only one who happened to be between leases, between jobs, at a crossroads the way people in their late 20s sometimes find themselves. So I moved in. Not permanently, I thought. Just to help stabilize things, figure out the next step, maybe find a local caregiver. 14 months later, I was still there. I don't say that with bitterness. I want to be clear about that because the bitterness came later and it came from somewhere else entirely. The 14 months I spent living with my grandfather were some of the best of my life. We watched old westerns after dinner. He taught me to make his mother's apple cake, the one with the brown sugar crumble on top that he'd been making since 1974. He told me things he'd never told anyone, about his time in Vietnam, about the years before he met my grandmother, about the version of himself he'd been before life shaped him into the man we all knew. I learned who he was, not Grandpa at Thanksgiving. Walter. When he got the diagnosis, small vessel disease, early stage vascular dementia, he sat very still for a long time after the doctor left the room. Then he looked at me and said, "Well, I'm glad you're here." I quit the remote consulting work I'd been picking up and started taking on his care full-time. Medications, appointments, physical therapy twice a week, coordinating with his primary care physician, managing his finances when his memory started making that complicated. I paid myself nothing. The arrangement was simple. I lived there, my expenses were covered, and I helped him. That was it. My uncle started calling it the arrangement, in the tone that made it clear he thought there was something suspicious about it. His name is Roland. He's my grandfather's son from his first marriage, which ended badly before my grandfather met my grandmother, and there had always been a tension between Roland and the rest of us that nobody ever directly addressed. Roland had money. He'd done well in commercial real estate. But he'd also always had an eye on what he believed was owed to him. The house on Sycamore Lane was worth somewhere around $490,000 by then. The retirement accounts, the savings, the small investment portfolio my grandfather had been quietly building for 30 years. Roland had been calculating all of it for a long time. I didn't know that then. I just thought he was difficult. He came to visit twice during those 14 months. Both times he took me aside and asked pointed questions about whether I was influencing Grandpa's decisions, whether I'd encouraged him to change anything. The second time, he brought his wife, and she spent most of the visit wandering through the house, touching things and commenting on how much the neighborhood had appreciated. I didn't think too much of it. Grandpa saw through Roland clearly. He always had. He'd say things like, "Roland means well," in a voice that communicated the opposite. Grandpa died in March. The funeral was small and honest, the way he would have wanted it. Afterward, when I was still in that numb, slow-motion state that follows a death you've been expecting but can never quite prepare for, my uncle called a family meeting. He held it at my mom's house, which I thought was strange. My aunt flew in from Denver. There were maybe 8 people around the dining room table when I arrived, and the first thing I noticed was that nobody quite met my eyes. Roland was already talking when I walked in. He had papers in front of him, printed emails, some kind of document I couldn't read from the door. He stopped when he saw me and said with a patience that felt rehearsed, "We were just getting started." I sat down. My mom was at the other end of the table looking at her hands. What Roland explained over the next 20 minutes was this. He had spoken with an estate attorney. He had concerns about undue influence. He believed that my proximity to Grandpa during his illness had created an opportunity for me to manipulate him, and he intended to contest the will. He didn't say what was in the will. I didn't know. Grandpa had never told me, and I had never asked, because it felt wrong to ask. The same way it feels wrong to look at someone's phone. "You need to understand," Roland said, "that a man with vascular dementia is considered a vulnerable adult under state law. Decisions made during that period can be challenged." "His diagnosis was early stage," I said. "He was legally competent until, that's for a court to decide." My Aunt Roland's half-sister said nothing. She was looking at the table. My mom finally looked up at me and I could see in her face that she had known this was coming and hadn't warned me, and that was the moment the numb feeling cracked open into something much colder. I left the meeting. I drove to a parking lot 3 blocks away and sat in my car for 45 minutes. Then I called a friend who had gone to law school, not because I thought she could help me, but because I needed to tell someone what had just happened out loud. She said, "Do you know the name of his estate attorney?" I did. Grandpa had mentioned him, a man named Mr. Hartwell, whose office was on the east side of town, who Grandpa had worked with for years. He'd updated his will about 8 months before he died. I knew that much because I had driven him to the appointment. I called Mr. Hartwell's office the next morning. What I didn't expect was that he had already been trying to reach me. His assistant said he'd called the house twice and left a voicemail on my cell that I hadn't noticed in the fog of the past 2 weeks. He wanted me to come in. There was something he needed to go over with me personally. Something that required me specifically to be present. I went that Thursday. His office was the old-fashioned kind, dark wood paneling, bookshelves floor to ceiling, the kind of place that felt like it had been designed to make you feel like matters of consequence happened here. Mr. Hartwell was in his 60s, unhurried, with the manner of someone who had spent decades delivering news, both kinds, and had learned not to rush either. He shook my hand, offered me coffee, and then set a folder on the desk between us. "Your grandfather was very specific," he said, "and very deliberate. I want you to understand that before I walk you through this. I've been practicing estate law for 31 years, and Walter Greer was one of the most clear-headed clients I've ever worked with." He paused, and something in his expression told me he was also telling me this because someone else had suggested the opposite. "He anticipated a challenge, Mr. Raunen," Hartwell continued. "He'd spoken with me about it more than once. The documentation here is thorough. At his own request, I was present at the signing, along with 2 independent witnesses and a notarized physician's statement confirming his legal competency, dated 1 week before the documents were executed." He slid the folder toward me. I opened it with hands that weren't entirely steady. The house on Sycamore Lane, the retirement accounts, a savings account I hadn't known about, a small parcel of land in Vermont that had been in the family for 3 generations and that I had heard about exactly once, when Grandpa mentioned it in passing while we were watching the weather one winter night. Everything. He had left me everything. There was a letter, too, folded separately, in an envelope with my name on it, in Grandpa's handwriting. Shaky in the way his handwriting had gotten in those last months, but unmistakably his. Mr. Hartwell gave me privacy to read it, stepping out of the office and closing the door softly behind him. I won't share everything in that letter. Some things are just mine. But I'll say that he wrote about the apple cake. He wrote about the westerns. He wrote about a night in December when I sat with him through a bad episode, one of those nights when the dementia surfaced hard and he was confused and frightened, and I just sat next to him on the edge of the bed and talked to him quietly until it passed. He said he remembered that. He said that the fact that he remembered it, that it was one of the things his mind held on to even when so much else was slipping, told him everything he needed to know. He wrote, "I know you didn't stay because of what I had. That's exactly why I'm leaving it to you." I sat in that office chair and cried in a way I hadn't let myself cry since he died. Not the polite, composed grief I'd been performing for 2 weeks. The real kind, the kind that makes you ugly and doesn't care. When Mr. Hartwell came back, I had pulled myself together enough to ask the practical questions. He explained that Grandpa had anticipated Roland's objection specifically, had anticipated it, prepared for it, and left a paper trail that Mr. Hartwell described, without any visible emotion, as unusually airtight. The physician's statement alone would make a capacity challenge extremely difficult to sustain. The independent witnesses. The documentation of Grandpa's own written reasoning. Your grandfather asked me to reach out to you directly, Mr. Hartwell said. He didn't want you to be ambushed. I thought about the family meeting. About Roland's papers on the table. About my mom looking at her hands. He thought it might happen while I was still in the middle of grieving, I said. He did. I asked what I should do. Mr. Hartwell said I didn't need to do anything yet. The will was solid. If Roland chose to file a formal challenge, they would respond. But his professional opinion was that once Roland's attorney reviewed the documentation, the challenge was unlikely to proceed. He was right. It took 3 weeks. 3 weeks during which Roland sent 2 letters through his attorney, during which my aunt stopped returning my calls, during which I moved through my days in a strange suspension, sorting through Grandpa's belongings, returning medical equipment, doing all the quiet administrative work of dismantling someone's daily life while simultaneously not knowing if I'd be allowed to stay in his house. Then Roland's attorney went quiet. No explanation. No phone call. My mom told me, secondhand, that Roland was reassessing. Later I heard through my aunt that his own attorney had advised him the case was unwinnable and that pursuing it would cost him more in legal fees than he stood to gain. I didn't hear from Roland directly for almost 2 months. When he finally called, he left a voicemail that was short and carefully worded. Something about how he hoped there were no hard feelings and that he was sure Grandpa had known what he was doing. I didn't call him back. I'm not sure that was the right thing or the wrong thing. I just know I didn't have it in me to perform a reconciliation I didn't feel. I still live in the house on Sycamore Lane. I'm in the middle of figuring out what to do with the Vermont land. I went up there last fall for the first time and stood in the middle of what turned out to be 6 acres of birch trees and didn't say anything for a long time. I think Grandpa might have wanted me to keep it. My mom and I have talked, more honestly than we ever had before. She didn't warn me about Roland's plan, but I understand now that she was caught between 2 loyalties and didn't handle it well. She said so herself, plainly, which is more than most people would do. We're working on it. My aunt, Roland's half-sister, sent a card about a month after everything settled. It just said, "I'm sorry. I should have said something." I appreciated that she sent it. I don't entirely know where we stand now, but I appreciated it. Here's the thing that took me a long time to understand. The thing I keep coming back to. I didn't move in with my grandfather because I expected anything from him. I moved in because he needed someone, and I was available, and somewhere in the back of my mind was this knowledge, quiet and simple, and not particularly heroic, that if I didn't do it, probably no one would. Not because my family didn't love him, they did. But love and proximity aren't the same thing, and being busy isn't the same thing as being gone, but the result is sometimes identical. What I got from those 14 months wasn't the house. It wasn't the accounts or the Vermont land or any of it. What I got was Walter, the real version, the man before the grandfather, the history before I arrived in it, the voice in that letter that sounded exactly like him, exactly the way he talked when it was just the 2 of us after dinner with the TV low and the kitchen still warm from whatever we'd made. That part Roland could never have touched. No legal challenge reaches that far. But I'll be honest, there's something clarifying about watching someone try to take something from you and fail. About having a piece of paper, signed and notarized, that says he saw you, he knew what he was doing, and he chose you anyway. After weeks of being made to feel like my presence had been something predatory, like my love had been a manipulation, my care a strategy, that piece of paper mattered. Not for the money, for the record. My grandfather knew it would matter. That's why he built the case before he was gone. He couldn't protect me from the family meeting, from the letters, from the 3 suspended weeks of not knowing. But he did the only thing he could do. He made sure the truth was documented. He made sure someone would walk into a room and say, without ambiguity, her name is the only name that's in here. I make the apple cake sometimes on weekends. Brown sugar crumble on top, the way he taught me, in the same pan he used for 40 years. The recipe is written on an index card in his handwriting, tucked inside a wooden recipe box that was his mother's, that now sits on the counter in the kitchen of the house on Sycamore Lane. Nobody built that for me, but somebody left it to me, and I understand the difference. I've thought a lot about why Roland did what he did. Not to excuse it. I'm not there yet, and I'm not sure I need to be, but just to understand it. Because understanding something and forgiving it are different things, and I think people sometimes confuse them. Roland saw a transaction where there was a relationship. He looked at 14 months of my life and calculated it in dollars. He decided that because I had lived in that house, eaten food from that kitchen, had my expenses covered, I had already been compensated. He genuinely believed that. I could hear it in his voice at the family meeting. Not guilt, not embarrassment, just the flat certainty of a man who had spent his whole life measuring things and assumed everything could be measured. What he couldn't account for was the night in December, the bad episode, the confusion, the fear in my grandfather's eyes when he didn't know where he was. You can't put a number on sitting next to someone in the dark and talking them back to themselves. You can't invoice that. And Walter knew. He knew in the way that people who are running out of time get very clear about what actually mattered, that what I had given him wasn't labor, it was presence. There's a difference, and most people only understand it when they're the one who needed someone to show up and almost nobody did. That's the thing about cause and effect that doesn't get talked about enough. It isn't always dramatic, it doesn't always announce itself. Roland made 100 small choices over 30 years. To stay distant, to show up twice in 14 months, to calculate instead of connect, and none of those choices felt like decisions at the time. They felt like just how things were. But they accumulated. They became a record. And my grandfather, who was one of the most quietly observant people I've ever known, had been keeping that record in his own way, not out of resentment but out of clarity. And I made choices too. I moved in without knowing how it would end. I stayed without a contract, without a guarantee, without anyone telling me it was the right thing. I made the appointments and managed the medications and learned to make the apple cake because he wanted to teach me and I wanted to learn. None of that was a strategy, but it was a record too. And records have a way of speaking for themselves, eventually, even when everyone around you is trying to tell a different version of the story. What I carried out of this. Not the house, not the accounts, the actual thing I carry is a belief in showing up without knowing the outcome. It's harder than it sounds. There's no guarantee that doing the right thing gets witnessed, documented, protected by an attorney who spent 31 years making sure the truth was airtight. Most of the time there's no Mr. Hartwell. Most of the time you just do the thing and it disappears into the ordinary texture of a life. But I think integrity is mostly built in those invisible moments, the ones nobody sees, the ones you don't even frame as choices because they just feel like what a person does. My grandfather saw them. He saw me when I wasn't performing for anyone, and in the end, that was the only audience that mattered. I'm still figuring out who I am on the other side of all of this. The grief, the fight, the strange relief of it being over. I make the apple cake. I walk through the house that smells like him. I think about the birch trees in Vermont and what I'll do with them someday. I don't have a clean conclusion. Life doesn't hand those out. But I know that I stayed, and I know why I stayed, and I know that he knew it too. That's enough. It has to be, and most days it genuinely is.